This is problem number 2 from section 3.2. In this problem, they tell us to solve this equation. As you can see, that equation, that's a quadratic. So we have 4 different ways to solve quadratics, just like we talked about in the previous video. The first way we could solve it would be factoring, but actually square roots is probably the first thing we want to look at. So let's look at the r squared term, and then we can see that we have another term that has an r in it. Because we have this other term in here, we cannot use the square root method. If that term were gone, we actually could use the square root method because we could divide by 3 and then square root each side and we get an answer. But because there's that other term with an r in it, we cannot use the square root method. Factoring, I usually try to avoid factoring if we have a leading coefficient on the r squared term. So because we have a leading coefficient of 3, I'm probably going to avoid factoring. Sometimes if we have a leading coefficient, I can factor out a 3 from each term. I might still try and factor, but in this case, probably not going to use factoring. In that case, usually I just jump straight to quadratic equation unless they specifically ask me to complete the square. So we're going to use the quadratic equation on this problem. Before we start though, using the quadratic equation, we want to get this so that it's so that the equation equals 0. All right, we're trying to find the zeros of the quadratic, so we want to get it to equal 0. So let's subtract 22r from both sides, and that's 3r squared minus 22r equals 16. Now let's subtract the 16 from each side, and that's 3r squared minus 22r minus 16 equals 0. Now we have the quadratic equation set up so that it's equal to 0, so we can actually find the zeros. Let's pull out the quadratic formula. Most students like the quadratic formula because they tell me, well, it gives you the answer every time. And that is very true. You got to remember the equation though, so this is something to start to memorize. Negative b plus or minus root b squared minus 4ac over 2a. So I always like to, at the top, usually, I'm not going to do it here, but usually I write a, b, and c out here. You can see a is 3, b is negative 22, and c is negative 16. So we're starting with negative b. So we say negative 22 plus and minus root b squared, which is negative 22 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 3, times c, which is negative 16, all over 2 times a, which is 2 times 3. I know this 3 is a terrible looking 3, but that's a 3 there. So we end up with x equals, this will be 22 plus and minus 22 squared, which is 484. So we have root 484. And then we have negative 4 times 3 times negative 16, which gives you a positive 192, so plus 192 under here, over 6. 484 and 192 is 676, so we have 22 plus and minus root 676 over 6. Then we can go ahead and take the root of 676, see if it works out nicely. Sometimes you'll have to reduce this, which is kind of a pain, but in this case, root of 676 is 26. So we get 22 plus and minus 26 over 6. At this point now, because there's 2 versions of this, I'm going to say x equals 22 plus 26 over 6, or 22 minus 26 over 6. And then evaluate those down. So 22 plus 26, that's 48 over 6. Or negative 4 over 6. Reduce this down. This is 8. Or negative 2/3. So our solutions to this problem are 8 and negative 2/3. And that's how you use the quadratic formula to solve this original quadratic equation.